Welcome to the DEEPMED Seminar, a history forum for ocean science, strategy, and environment. The DEEPMED Seminar is brought to you by European Research Council-funded research project DEEPMED, which stands for Discovering the Deep Mediterranean Environment, a History of Science and Strategy, 1860 to the present. Today, no less than Helen Rozwadowski will be discussing continuities between early modern and modern ocean mapping with the Shakespearean hit that she will explain very soon. Helen barely needs introduction to this community. She works at the University of Connecticut, where she also sails and organizes exhibits and all other kinds of interesting stuff. She's the author of many, many important works in the history of oceanography and beyond, I would say. Her first two books are landmarks in the field, The Sea Knows No Boundaries and Fathoming the Oceans. They were both of them very relevant in boosting the discipline in the early 2000s. She was, of course, not the first historian of oceanographer, but she was very important in making the discipline larger and better known. Her latest book, Vast Expanses, A History of the Oceans, is 2018, and I think it brings together that earlier history of oceanography with environmental history and history of the ocean space itself, which is, I think, a very interesting development of where the discipline is going and where it could go. In between, she wrote important papers, but also she co-edited a number of also very relevant books, including Extremes, The Machines on Neptune's Garden, and Sounding and Crossings. Today, we are very lucky to have her here in the room because she was kind enough to visit us in Sevilla for a few days. And also because June is full with conferences. Some of the DEEPMED members are not here in the room, but they are connected online. And there are also, of course, many other people online. So I encourage questions from the other side of the screen. And then, Helen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm very grateful. I was going to say it's terrific to be here, but thank you, especially Maria, because trying to operate teams is anyway, I'm very excited to be here and to get to know the DEEPMED program in person. I've been following the seminar all year, and it's a great seminar. And so thanks to everyone who's been part of this project, and thanks for including me in it. It's pretty exciting. All right, I'm going to start by telling you two stories about why I'm interested in trying to span the early modern and modern efforts to understand oceans. And then this is an outline of my talk. Start with the two stories. I'm going to tell you a little bit kind of using other people's research, including some people you've seen before in this series, about early modern uses of and knowledge creation of the volumetric ocean. And by that, I mean including the undersea, not just the surface of the ocean. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some research that I've done on representing oceans on early modern maps. And then I'm going to come back to this 19th century context, which I will start with, and look at connections that seem to be there between early modern interest in use and kind of cultural understanding of the ocean in the 19th century. Okay, so the first of the two stories. So this is a quote that I'll leave on the screen for a second. When many years ago, when I was working on my dissertation, I was really struck by this quote: "Could the waters of the Atlantic be drawn off so as to expose to view this great Sea-Gash?" And the quote goes on to talk about, the ribs of the solid earth with the foundations of the sea would be brought to light. And it's this image of dead men's skulls, heaps of great anchors, heaps of pearl. It's a very poetic description written by Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was a U.S. naval officer credited with the first program of regular deep sea soundings in the North Atlantic. And he has been called the quote unquote father of oceanography and the pathfinder of the seas. He has been especially praised by people associated with the US Navy and people also in the 19th century and historians in the present who like to credit the US for firsts in history of oceanography because he did his work before the Challenger. So this is part of the historiography. He organized the first international meteorological conference in 1853. He was a very important figure in internationalizing ocean science and atmospheric sciences as well. And his science was inextricably connected to his personal abiding goal of extending the institution of racial slavery from the United States to other places. And I just want to point out that while conducting science in the national interest was not and is not unusual, it's really important to acknowledge ideologies like Maury's racism when they're embedded in the science itself. And I'll kind of return to that point later. But let me give you a bit more background on Maury and his career before circling back to the quote. He was born in Virginia in 1806, grew up in Tennessee, so in the first west of the United States. And he entered naval service as a midshipman and spent a few years with the kind of typical on-the-job training of midshipmen. At one point, when he was assigned to be sailing master on a Navy ship and was told that he would sail around Cape Horn, he looked around for wind and current information for this voyage and couldn't find anything. So when he came back from his journey, he published his own account of the trip in 1834 in Silliman's Journal, which was a very respected early American science journal. So he's sort of marking his interest in contributing to science. He expected to rise through the ranks, but he suffered a carriage accident that left him with a badly broken leg that was set poorly, and he walked with a limp and used a cane for most of the rest of his life, which disqualified him for service at sea. In 1842, he was given command of the U.S. Navy Depot of Charts and Instruments. And of course, a main part of his job was caring for the chronometers and the charts, but he also found a storeroom full of old logbooks, which he recognized would provide knowledge on winds and currents of the sort that he had himself looked for when he was trying to plan that voyage around Cape Horn. So he set his subordinate officers to work transcribing the data that these logbooks contained, and he began to use it to begin a chart of the Atlantic that would display the historical tracks of ships and the winds and currents they encountered. So here's an example of one of his winds and current charts with a kind of a detail. His first effort grew into a series of charts that represented tracks of historical voyages, winds, currents, temperatures, storm, rainfall, and even whale sightings. In addition to using old logs, Maury enlisted the help of naval officers and merchant mariners who provided data from their voyages in exchange for completed charts like these. He also attended meetings of early scientific societies and delivered papers on the chart's benefits to science, with the idea that they would assist in ongoing efforts to understand both the atmosphere and the ocean. So he had scientific ambitions pretty early on. From early in his career, he criticized the education and training of naval officers. And 2 years after his first scientific publication, he published, to try to solve this problem, a textbook to improve the education of naval officers. And then, not listed on this slide, in 1840 and 41, he published anonymously a series of articles advocating for naval reform, and he published these in Richmond, Virginia's Southern Literary Messenger. So a bit of literary ambitions to go with the scientific ones. After he arrived at the Depot of Charts and Instruments, he began publishing what became a series of practical works that kind of established his reputation. And they were called, after the first one, they were called Explanations and Sailing Directions to Accompany Wind and Current Charts. And he put out new editions, as you see, very regularly. The great Sea-Gash quote that I showed you first appeared in 1853 in the 5th edition of Explanations and Sailing Directions. And it also appeared in a book that was kind of largely cribbed from these explanations and sailing directions called The Physical Geography of the Sea, that was published in 1855. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. So what struck me about this quote is that it borrowed heavily from a description of the seabed in one of Shakespeare's plays, Richard III. And in the text on the left there, I've highlighted the quotes that are exact, the words that are exact and phrases that are exact quotes from the quote itself. And it was very common, of course, for historians of the 19th century are familiar with this. It was very common to do this kind of copying. That was just normal to do. But it is, let me explain a little bit about the speech here. So in this speech, Clarence, who is in the Tower of London imprisoned, relates a dream of being knocked overboard from the deck of a ship by his brother Richard, which turns out to be a prophecy because later he's drowned to enable Richard to have the throne. So Clarence narrates the seafloor as a place that preserves the violence of warfare and shipwreck, a place that hides riches, and a place that is very, very profoundly not a human environment, at least not for living humans. So today I wonder, what did it mean that Maury reached out to Shakespeare and Shakespeare's ocean descriptions and ocean visions as he saw it in the mid-19th century to interpret and investigate the ocean's depths scientifically? In the past, and I guess I should say that when I was an undergraduate, I was an English and biology double major. So this interest in paying attention to literature in history is something that comes from a long time ago. So in the past, I assumed that it emerged from Maury's literary ambitions, part of his self-definition as an educated person who contributed to science. And this is very consistent with his family history. His family valued education. They valued studying nature to see God's power. And it also fits with his kind of financial and social status. His grandparents were from wealthy slave-owning families, but his father was in debt for most of his life, and he himself was also not very financially secure. So, in other words, I saw this use of Shakespeare and great literature to signal education and social status. But I didn't see it as potentially more than that until recently. And it didn't most notably occur to me at that time to think about the possibility that people in Shakespeare's time had a meaningful cultural relationship with the undersea, with the volumetric ocean, and that relationship might in some ways resemble the human relationship with the ocean in the mid-19th century, that there might be some parallels that would be interesting to think about and work with. So the second story is also a long story in a different way. In 2004, I gave a paper with my colleague, Michael Reedy, which we submitted to a journal. And this is sort of an object lesson for junior scholars, perhaps. Typically, we got one terrific review and one terrible review. And no guidance from the editor. So we abandoned the paper. We just thought we would never publish it. And years later, when I was invited to edit an ocean focus section of ICIS, we actually revised it and probably made it much better. And it was published 10 years later. So keep going, don't give up. So that's one of the lessons. But the point for today is that putting this paper together, this started me thinking about how, why, and by whom the oceans were known in the mid-19th century. So the paper points to tight interconnections between oceans, science, and empire, and particularly points to the significance of graphical representations of ocean knowledge, like Matthew Fontaine Maury's, but also like Whewell's tidal maps, Herschel's terrestrial magnetism maps, and so on. And it noted the role these played in making ocean knowledge usable by mariners and other agents of empire. So we wrote this paper with an assumption that now I'm questioning, that the blank oceans and charts, blank oceans of charts and maps in from the 18th century forward reflected a kind of a lack of interest in or knowledge pursued about the volumetric oceans. In other words, reflected the idea that people were interested in the surface of the oceans, but not the depths. But lately I've started asking myself, what if earlier oceans weren't actually so empty? Okay. So in learning more about hydrography and charting, I discovered that by the 18th century, what I considered the sort of starting points, nautical charts and terrestrial maps were by that time relatively distinct forms. In both, Enlightenment practices and theories of mapping produced oceans that were gridded with lines of latitude and longitude, which had the effect, which I was sort of observing, of drawing attention to the ocean's surfaces and their importance for trade and for power projection. While navigational maps focused on the undersea, terrestrial maps didn't. And so for a long time, I believed that those blank ocean spaces on maps really did reflect a greater cultural, political, and economic focus on ocean surfaces relative to their volume. And as I said, that's what I've started questioning. So I wrote in Vast Expanses, blank spaces on maps appear to reflect a revision of the sea from a dangerous and mysterious place into a knowable part of the natural world whose control enabled the exploitation of marine resources and the expansion of European power. So I wrote this at a moment when more scholars began studying the early modern period, who were studying the early modern period, began writing about oceans. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of that research to show you the extent to which they're discovering that people interested, that people in the early modern period, especially people interested in creating knowledge about the natural world in the early modern period, were highly aware of the ocean and its riches and its resources and its possibilities. Okay, so that's this next paper. So I'll start with pearls. So when Columbus found pearl beds in the Caribbean in 1498, he found an alternative source for pearls that, unlike pearling that was done previously and for hundreds of years in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, was able to come under European control. And in her very good book, Molly Warsh argues that pearls, quote, loomed large in visions of seaborne successes as Spain and Portugal began to extend their Atlantic exploration in the 15th century. Pearls emerged from the watery depth of an ocean that sustained life, but also threatened and delivered destruction. And pearls acted, quote, as symbols of the riches as well as the dangers of the high seas. And I'll just mention that the picture on the upper right-hand corner is from an ostensory that I took a picture of in Prague, where I just was before this. And it's these beautiful Baroque pearls, and it looks very much like many of the images in Molly Warsh's book. And there are other great books about pearls and pearling in this period that I put on the slide. So although it's not the main thread of Warsh's work, it's clear that pearls brought Europeans' attention to the ocean, especially to the undersea. And that's the point I want to make here. And I guess right. And then I have this picture to show you that pearls and pearling certainly made people who were directly involved in the industry quite familiar with the undersea. This 17th century image illustrates 4 different ways pearls were fished in different places, with wide nets, with basket nets, with sticks, and so on. And this brings us to the topic of diving and swimming, which is a topic that has gained quite a lot of attention, and that attention extends to the deep past. So diving has been carried on for much of human history, presumably initially to gather food, and for at least thousands of years to collect pearls, coral, sponges, and other things, and eventually to salvage vessels. Cultures around the world have traditions of diving and swimming, and one of my favorite things that I learned working on Vast Expanses was this recent research that Neanderthals dove and swam, and that just sort of reminds us that this is something, it's part of the human condition, wondering or having the idea that people, wouldn't use the undersea if they were nearby is kind of a crazy idea. I guess that's the main point here. So James Del Borgo, writing of the collection of aquatic things by Hans Sloane and other early modern natural history collectors, explains, quote, "The aquatic collector paradoxically exhibited his piety by emulating divine power, creating conditions for vision into the watery part of creation by raising its treasures from the depths." So recovery and display of aquatic objects also, of course, advertised imperial claims of ocean mastery. But the recovery of these objects, as of pearls or shipwreck salvage, was most often carried out by enslaved labor, especially when it was done with free diving. I'll get to technology in a minute. This labor was, according to historian Kevin Dawson, deliberately expropriated from cultures such as those in West Africa that had knowledge and practices of swimming, of diving, and of working underwater. Del Borgo points out that in the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans scrutinized indigenous diving as part of their wider efforts to understand the world and nature and human bodies and things like that. And it's worth reminding ourselves that few Europeans could swim at this time. Out just last month is Michael Jung's English translation of his comprehensive German work on the history of early modern diving in Europe, with a focus on diving technology and emerging scientific understanding of diving. The need to salvage sunken ships carrying silver to Spain stimulated European efforts to develop diving techniques and equipment. In the mid-17th century, the British Royal Society, and especially Robert Boyle, conducted research on diving that was extended into the 18th century to research on air and its constituents. Together, this research formed the basis for scientific understanding of diving. And diving, using the technology chronicled in this book, formed the basis for the modern salvage industry. I'll say a few words about fishing. A group of historians has proposed that the birth and rapid growth of intensive European fishing around Newfoundland should be called the, quote, fish revolution, for the size of the fishery, the impact on European markets and diets, and also the environmental effects that this fishery had. They conclude that historians have grossly underestimated the historical economic significance of the fish trade, which may have been equal to the much more famed rush to exploit the silver mines of the Incas, which is really quite a striking claim. Just want to dwell on, if that's true, we should be paying a lot more attention to fish than we have as historians. The fish revolution was a major event in the history of resource extraction and consumption that permanently changed human and animal life in the North Atlantic region. So one feature of cod fisheries, because of the need to dry and later salt the fish, was the seasonal use of coasts for processing work. Historian Jacques Bouchard argues that the fishery, in addition to providing fish and thus forming part of the colonial commercial expansion, also played a role akin to permanent state-backed settlements. That is, they served as a form of occupation along these faraway coasts, seasonal, and also that they fueled other colonial projects. So if you look at the lower left image, you see the ships, but then you see the areas where the cod are drying on both coasts of that open piece of water. And the upper right image is a map of what Jacques Bouchard argues that his historical actors called Terra Nova, which is the ocean space that they fished in around Newfoundland, that operated in this colonial way. As with pearling and salvage diving, fishing involved the creation and use of ocean knowledge, including the presence and movements of fish underwater. The map detail on the right shows a fishing boat on top, and below you see two smaller boats. The middle one is hand lining for cod, and the bottom one is using a seine net for sardines or herring, schooling fish. And this shows the technology and techniques, but it also reflects the knowledge of those fish and how to catch them. On the left is a French map of Terra Nova, and you can see the amount of detail there, depth measurements, shapes of bank. How much you can see in this chart, how much knowledge of the sea was gained through fishing. The recording and communicating or keeping secret of that knowledge increasingly became a matter of concern for governments. And to just remind you of a talk you heard already in this series, at about the same time as that Grand Bank map, the French government published the law text Ordonnance de la Marine, concerned with all things marine and maritime. This was a strategic effort at economic development that Ellen Crafting told you about. It distinguished important parts of marine nature to be husbanded by the government. And this emerged from aims to compete internationally with Dutch and English competitors on the one hand, and on the other hand, to oppose on a domestic level private claims to shores or coastal waters in order to reserve them for the state. It was not possible to control the ocean itself, of course, but this text included efforts to manage risk through insurance. And the ordinance included regulation of fishing and extraction of other marine resources, including seaweed, stranded whales, even the bodies of shipwreck victims and their possessions. In short, the ordinance reflected government response to significant use and knowledge of the oceans and their resources, encompassing volumetric ocean space and not just the surface. And just to bring you right up to date to the last DEEPMED talk, which focused on early modern knowledge creation about the undersea. I'll mention a few examples that Yip talked about, including Marsigli's Gulf of Lion map and his depth profiles, Marsigli's depth profiles, as well as Nicolaus Crucius's and his attention to depths in his maps and models of river flow. And so that leaves us with this sort of list of important context to keep in mind for when Richard III was composed by William Shakespeare, which was in the late 16th century. The Spanish Armada had been defeated, kind of opening the door for strengthening English imperialism. Shipwreck salvage was already important and became more important. The Caribbean pearl fishery at that moment was about 100 years old. The fish revolution was also about 100 years old, and the Terra Nova fishery was, serving as a kind of colonial foundation for Europe in the New World. Some of the other things I talked about, Hans Sloane, the French ordinance, and Marsigli had not yet happened, but just to kind of fix in our minds what's happening at the time Shakespeare wrote that thing. Another thing that was happening is that in the history of mapping, there was a very particular way that ocean space was being represented on maps in the early modern period, exactly corresponding to this time when Shakespeare wrote this Richard III. And that's what I want to talk to you about now. When I was writing Vast Expanses, I wrote a short section based on looking at world maps and how oceans were represented on world maps. And as an extension of that, last year I had the opportunity to join the Maritime Modernities Project at the University of Oslo and spend some time studying early modern maps of Northern Europe, which have the advantage of showing really quite a lot of ocean space. And so I'm going to show you a few slides of what I found looking at maps from the 1500s and 1600s, and then I'll revisit Maury's great Sea-Gash quotes, try to tie these things together. So the earliest printed maps following Ptolemy often distinguished ocean waters in some way from land. The map on the right has blue hand coloring, for example. And this map is the first printed map of the Nordic region. This is a region that was unknown to Ptolemy. So this is a kind of an innovative, cartographically innovative step of taking Ptolemy's way of representing geography, but showing a geography that was not familiar to him. This convention of showing oceans as different from land was something that became very distinctive throughout the 1500s and into the 1600s. And another thing that seems to have arisen very early and continued was very frequently visual efforts to distinguish shallower coastal areas from open oceans. And both of these maps show little kind of parallel hash marks right close to the coast, and the treatment of the open ocean is different. Many 16th century maps that include a lot of ocean space render it as full or fuller of markings than land. So on the left, you see a map that, according to map historians, is one of the first non-derivative and consequential maps of Scandinavia after that Ptolemaic map I just showed you. And in the ocean, you see the use of lines, some parallel, some curved, many irregular squiggles to denote ocean space. There's the label Terra Baccaia, which refers to Newfoundland and its rich coastal fisheries, although it is placed on what is labeled Groenlandia, so that's a little strange. And you see some creatures, one east of Ireland that looks kind of whale-like, and the other west of Ireland that might be more like a sea monster. And cartographers have pointed out that more exotic sea creatures were often put at the edges of maps and at the edges of known geographies. In the map on the right, the ocean is much less dramatic, but still very full. And lines in the mid-ocean are curved, and there's also some white space, perhaps suggesting waves, possibly distinguishing open ocean waters from coastal ocean waters. And just to give you two more examples from also the mid-16th century, just to demonstrate the variety of ways that map makers depicted ocean space, but to point out that they all found some way to fill it in. And filling in the oceans, I argue, calls attention to the physical volumetric seas and to the time and effort it took to travel over them. It's also an aesthetic choice, for sure. But it likely reflected the importance of oceans to societies that relied on ocean trade and societies that actively used oceans to build empires. And on the map on the right, take note of Mare Congelatum in the upper left around Islandia, and notice that it's represented differently, this cold ocean space, frozen ocean space with dots and short dashes instead of longer wavy lines. All right, so these two maps confirm an intent to represent particular ocean features. The one on the right is by a mapmaker named Tramezzini, and it includes details of use to mariners, including perpendicular labels of port towns, which is the carryover from Portolan charts, careful markings of distance and time and latitude and longitude, and you see in the middle on the bottom of that chart dividers that go with the scale of the map. This was a reduced size copy of an earlier map, which I have a terrible photograph of on the left only. And that one was made by somebody named Anthonazun, printed in 1543, but lost. But later printed by someone else using the original woodblock. So we can see what was in the lost original, even though we don't have the original. Anthonazun spent time at sea and learned navigation, and the cartouche text explains that the map is made for the benefit of whomever would teach himself the true distance of these places. So precision of distance and locations was intentional. The cartouche explains the compass rose. The text explains one more feature. Moreover, we have carefully marked the shallows, which pose great danger to sailors, with colors and dots. Now, these maps were not, in fact, colored, but they might have. The intent might have been to hand color. We don't know. We don't know what the original one was, but the intent might have been to hand color the dots. But the dots are placed in places like the inside of the Frisian Islands, the western coast of Jutland, places that are, make sense, that are shallower. And so the point of this story being that these examples show an intent to represent areas, shallow areas of concern for mariners or navigation on what is still a map and not a chart. In 1539, this very famous map was made by the Swedish priest Olaus Magnus, the first large-scale regional map of Europe. And among its many features and details. This map includes what two oceanographers convincingly argue is a representation of a particular ocean feature, the Iceland Faroes Front, a meeting and mixing of cold polar waters from north of Iceland and warmer North Atlantic waters from the south. These scientists point to a series of whirls drawn on the map to the east of Iceland and extending north of the Faroe Islands, but not continuing on to the Norwegian coast. And this is precisely the area of the front. And because there is no other place on the map that includes whirls set so systematically, they conclude this could be a deliberate attempt to represent this front, which would have been well known to navigators, including Norse Vikings and Hanseatic merchant captains. In 1572, an engraver, a well-known engraver named Lafreri, made this reduced size copy of Olaus's map. And he was part of a group of map makers that produced maps of novel artistry and accuracy. Here you see representations of ocean creatures and maritime activity. This was a common, though far from universal, element on maps in the 16th century. These kind of representations continued into the 17th century, even as the ocean waters themselves were less fully rendered. So you got fewer waves, but the ships and the marine creatures remained in some, but not all maps. This map is incredibly distinctive in how much detail is there on both land and sea. But the point is that oceans in these maps are, the oceans are represented as full of marine life, full of maritime activity, as much so as land, or more so, reflecting the economic importance of trading and the burgeoning imperial extraction of far-flung resources of both land and sea. During the 17th century, you saw maps devoting more attention to land space and kind of almost physically crowding out ocean space, which you see on the right. But even here, the oceans are filled with surfacing and diving whales, no more sea monsters, and many, 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 many ships, more than 100 sailing on different points of sail, individually in fleets, naval battles. You have smaller rigs in inshore waters and larger ships and rigs in offshore waters. This is a busy ocean full of valuable whales and activities. So one geographic region inspired particular attention to oceans in the 17th century. That is the northern Arctic waters, particularly following the discovery of Svalbard by Barents. You had Dutch and English companies began whaling, shore whaling, which meant that the discovery of land was critical to allowing there to be an industry from, say, the 1630s onward. You see, unlike the map on the left with some fanciful creatures, Barents' map is full of recognizable sea creatures. Whales have the characteristic two-lobed tail that's horizontal and not vertical like a fish. And baleen whales, such as bowheads, are depicted with two spouts, and you can see that in the detail, reflecting their double blowholes as opposed to other whales, toothed whales, that have single blowholes. So these details suggest knowledge of the kind of whales found in this region. And you also see recognizable groups of seals and walruses shown in the water, despite the fact that later, when fisheries developed for them, those fisheries took place on land. So this is reflecting someone, with firsthand experience of seeing these animals. Whaling expanded dramatically from the 1830s, and by the mid-17th century, maps of whaling in the seas around these areas depicted images that show you details of how many people are in the whaleboats and what kind of harpoons they used and exactly which species of whales were being pursued. Starting in the 1650s, whalers began setting out in large vessels to hunt whales offshore, because whales had abandoned the fjords and coastal waters of Spitsbergen and other places that hosted whaling stations. And here you see the small boats going after the whales, the small boats that were launched from the bigger ships. By the end of the 17th century, at the time of these two maps, there were between 200 and 300 ships and about 10,000 whalers hunting whales and also seals in the waters and coasts depicted on these charts. So it's a huge fishery. So through the mid-18th century, ships and sometimes whaling scenes lingered on a few maps. And in some cases, this was because the same plate was used. We've seen that before. But the depictions of the pursuit of bowhead whales in the Arctic, even when they were on charts, grew anachronistic as that fishery waned. So that sort of left these representations to be more nostalgic or decorative. And here you see examples of the growing distinction between charts and maps. The left is by Lucas Jansson Wagner, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, which was full of information of use to mariners and is sort of understood to be the precursor to nautical charts, broadly speaking. And so in this chart, you see depth measurements, anchorages, a scale for distance, a compass rose, but you also see banks that are good for fishing. My favorite detail of this whole talk, you have the whole fish are cod that live on the bottom. And when the little small heads poking their fish poking their heads above the surface are schooling fish like herring. And so he's finding ways to represent knowledge of those two different kinds of fish that would both occur on banks like that. In the open ocean are two vessels as well as large fish. You can tell from the tail that it's meant to be a whale, all of which show signs of displacing water as the ships sail forward and the whale breaches. The convention of continuing to represent actual water moved around by ships and creatures extends into the 17th century, even after the rest of the ocean space began to be left blank. And that's something that you can see on the map on the right. So images of marine animals and ships disappeared from the majority of the maps by the end of the 17th century. And these are the last two maps from the 17th century that are held in the National Library of Norway, just to show you that distinction between heading toward a nautical chart and heading toward a land map. You know, the map on the right, you can see has virtually no visual information about oceans other than the shape of the basins as an inverse of the shape of land masses, and the one on the left is starting to look like a nautical chart. So just to add to the context of the moment in which Richard III composed that Clarence's dream speech, maps were filled, included filled ocean space and did a good job representing volumetric oceans. So the Shakespearean scholar known for his work in elucidating the blue humanities, Steve Metz, and I'm pointing to his recent book, Introduction to the Blue Humanities, as a terrific resource, argues that the Clarence's dream speech reflects contemporary economic, political, and cultural engagements with the oceans. He writes, Clarence's nightmare vision shows Shakespeare bridging the mythic and the modern, blending a sea with the capacity for agency with one use as a tool for exploration and trade. This mix underscores the danger of the entity and the risk associated with commercial ventures, hence a sea bottom enriched by losses from those enterprises. So to return to Maury's quote, I'm suggesting here that in addition to the personal and social and intellectual reasons why somebody like Maury would reach to quote Shakespeare, there are also parallels between Maury's context and the importance, the role and importance of the ocean in the early modern period. So let me tell you a few more things about Maury. Maury intended his wind and current charts to be practical, but he had ambitions for these systematic studies of the ocean to also contribute to knowledge, to science. So he wrote these wind and current charts, attracted the attention of the commercial world, but did not escape the notice of philosophers everywhere. And he also pointed out that the very famous scientist Alexander von Humboldt is of the opinion that the results already obtained from this system of research are sufficient to give rise to a new department of science, which calls the physical geography of the sea. So this is quite a statement. Humboldt is a physical geographer, and Maury titled his book as opposed to his explanations and sailing directions, The Physical Geography of the Sea. That's a very ambitious title for a publication. So Maury made references in his Physical Geography of the Sea to early modern natural philosophers who dealt with the oceans, including Marsigli. And he also specifically mentioned that he used a translation of Marsigli into Dutch by Boerhaave, who's another early modern knowledge producer about the oceans. He mentions a Dr. Vitaliano Donati, professor of botany at Turin, whose correspondence in the mid-18th century about earthquakes with Abraham Tremblay, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, resulted in Tremblay concluding that there are, and he quotes in this footnote here, at the bottom of the water, mountains, plains, valleys, and caverns, just as on land. So Maury used early modern knowledge of the ocean in his ocean descriptions and in his visual representations of knowledge. On the right, you see a vertical profile, and the top half of it shows the elevation of the Earth from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic, showing the depression below the sea level across the ocean through the Azores to Europe. And this one was published first in the 5th edition of Sailing Directions, the same one that had the great Sea-Gash quote. This image expresses continuity of early modern ideas, Marsigli's and others. For example, the extension of mountain ranges under the sea, the idea that the greatest depths must equal the greatest heights of land. So in Physical Geography of the Sea, Maury noted that the greatest depth that his crew had fathomed up to date was about 25,000 feet, which was the same height as Chimborazo, believed by Humboldt and others at the time to be the world's highest mountain. Before the great Sea-Gash quote, literally the sentence before, Maury declares, from the top of Chimborazo to the bottom of the Atlantic is 9 miles. His written description of the Atlantic basin in the true interpretation of these laws, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. In its entire length, the sea is a trough. This ocean furrow was scored into the solid crust of our planet by the almighty hand. So this description reflects that Maury shared with past men of science, early modern men of science, a religious motivation for studying the natural world. And this is important to point out because it's a strong contrast with his contemporaries in the mid-19th century who criticized him for exactly this sort of move because they were interested in purely scientific explanations of things. Maury's list of people who should or would have interest in physical geography of the sea included, as you can see in this quote, the planter, as well as the merchant, the husbandman, as well as the mariner, and states as well as individuals. And he also, though he didn't say so here, meant philosophers. And this same list would pertain to the early modern period. As trade increased, plantations were established, merchant capitalism developed in the early modern period, and all of these things relied inextricably on the sea. One further thing Maury shared with people of the early modern period was the conception of the importance of the ocean and knowledge of them for empire. After asserting that mapping the bottom of the ocean was as important as mapping mountain ranges, Maury wrote, the bottom of the Atlantic or its depressions below the sea level are given perhaps on this plate with as much accuracy as the best geographers have been enabled to show on a map the elevation of the sea level of the interior of either Africa or Australia. That's a pretty confident quote. And it's a pretty striking comparison to even have the ambition that one could have that amount of knowledge about the bottom of the ocean. Maury viewed his and the United States Navy's deep sea sounding program and as the wind and current charts as demonstrations of U.S. ingenuity, signaling burgeoning U.S. imperial power through ability to know and use the ocean. And his pride is clear in the quote below. Until the commencement of the plan of deep sea soundings, as now conducted in the American Navy, the bottom of what the sailors call the blue water was as unknown to us as the interior of any planets in our system. So you go from being, thanks to American ingenuity, unknown as the interior of a planet to being better known than Australia or the interior of Africa. Maury took great pride and satisfaction that his nation led the investigation of the ocean steppes, especially starting in 1854, because the Crimean War had distracted the British. He wrote about the US Congress. That body, in a spirit worthy of representatives of a free and enlightened people, had authorized the Secretary of the Navy to employ 3 public vessels to assist in perfecting the discoveries and in conducting the investigations connected therewith. He felt that deep sea sounding was a particularly democratic pursuit because it could be done with simple technology by US naval vessels and personnel. And he also, as I've argued in this paper with Penelope Hardy, envisioned his science as laying the groundwork for the spread of racial slavery from the US South to other places outside of the US, including Mexico and other places in South America. Although Maury asserted the philosophical importance of physical geography of the sea, he delighted in quoting Benjamin Franklin, "What is the use of a newborn babe?" to assure his reader of the immediate and marvelous use of deep sea knowledge. He described a seafloor in the North Atlantic that he named the Telegraph Plateau. This was positioned coincidentally at exactly the Great Circle, the shortest distance between US and Europe, which was where the submarine telegraphy promoters hoped to lay a cable. This feature, which he promptly labeled Telegraph Plateau, seemed to Maury a marvelous exception to the otherwise rugged bottom topography that seemed to be emerging from the early deep sea soundings. And indeed, Maury's assurances aided the 1857 and 1858 cable laying project. But to return to the focus of the paper, I suggest that the reasons why Maury reached for Shakespeare to craft this description of the sea bottom includes both the personal, social, literary, professional reasons that I outlined, and also certain kinds of connections to early modern knowledge. Maury's awareness of Marsigli and other early modern ocean investigators. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the view or understanding of ocean knowledge as a foundation for empire and for imperialism and colonialism. And this is just a picture of where I usually work. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Helen. This was a lot, a lot in the talk, which is great. And I'm sure there are also questions, and there are so many options, so many possibilities in which this can go. So congratulations, and thanks a lot for sharing with us. Questions, anyone online also? Maria, could we see the people online somehow?
Yes. Yeah. There. Alberto, the question.
Alberto.
I would say Lino should be the expert on straits. Yeah, no, I think the examples of maps I've looked at have mostly been kind of ocean basin scale maps, but I think that studying straits is very important because, you know, if you look at the oceans in a big picture historical way, as I tried to do in Vast Expanses, you realize that straits are these key points where, you know, a group of people who use an ocean basin, you know, the straits are sort of the key place where they become aware of a connecting piece of ocean water somehow. And so I think those are that makes them incredibly important places to look, kind of more important because they relate to sort of the ocean history of maybe two different parts of the ocean and how they're connected. I'm afraid I don't have anything.
Yeah, no, so Alberto Jeep Van Gogh, who you quoted and is not here because he's at a conference, but he will very likely watch this talk on YouTube and
Yes.
learn much from it. So together with myself, we're working a little bit on the Strait of Gibraltar, and they are doing the early modern part.
Yeah.
And they are finding many, many interesting maps and then trying to figure out how representation changes. But something very interesting that I think it's precisely what you were saying and shows the continuity between the two periods is that Mayhan's The Influence of the Sea upon World History or something
Oh,
like
yes,
that,
yes.
or Sea Power. It was published in 1890, and he talks there about different historical moments in which straits as choke points for defending and for navies and so on are important. That was also the case in previous periods. So there is a continued interest in certain spaces, which I think can be very likely traced on maps.
Yeah, and I guess I would also say that I came to my map project with an interest in especially living marine resources, and so that sort of shaped the kind of maps I was looking at. With a greater interest in power projection, straits would obviously be much more important. And those maps probably aren't big enough to have that kind of textured ocean space that the scale of maps I was looking at would have. Certain kinds of maps had no representation of volumetric oceans even in the 15th and 16th centuries, including isolaria, these island map atlas kind of things. But the bigger scale maps did, and that was partly an aesthetic choice. But I'm arguing that it also reflects the importance of the ocean in these cultures. I think you would find something different there might be more connections between portolan charts and charts of straits because of their use for navigation and power projection would be my guess.
I haven't really. Oh, sorry. There is a question online. Pablo or Jose Carlos. We can't hear you.
You're muted.
It's me.
I think the other participant was first.
Oh, sorry. That's right. Alessandra.
Sorry, I didn't write the full name. Okay, so thank you very much for the time. I have so many questions. I have to take notes. So I'll be brief. First, I'd like to ask whether on the Scandinavian maps.
More slow.
Can you hear me? I had no microphone, sorry. Okay, so I wanted to ask whether the maps that you read, that you consulted in Scandinavia were written in a local language. And the reason why I'm asking this is that I would like to know whether there is some research, some tradition in mapping the ocean. And so the language the maps are written it means that they are meant to be useful for a very local audience, or they might circulate more broadly. And then I would like to ask you whether this practice of putting images, filling the map with images, which disappeared, you said, at the end of the 17th century, has sources in the primary literature, whether you could find any explanation in the original authors of the reason why the images disappeared. Thanks.
I don't know why the images disappeared, except that it happened at the time that nautical charts were differentiating from land maps, and land maps were focusing less on oceans. That literally, you would see older maps would show, half ocean space if it was Northern Europe. And that last map of Norway I showed, the ocean was crowded off the edge and Scandinavia was put in the middle. So if it's a map of Scandinavia, it's no longer, the oceans are no longer considered part of Scandinavia by the 17th, 18th century maps. And if you wanted a map of the ocean, you had to go find a special map of the ocean. And so I think it's related to that. I think that navigational maps stopped having fanciful pictures because that's not what they were for. So I don't, that's my theory. I am working on a paper with a map curator from the National Library of Norway, and there doesn't seem to be secondary work that explains this very well. There's some work on ships on maps, there's some work on sea monsters on maps, but there's not a kind of there hasn't been anything that we found that looked at the representation of the water itself, and that looked at all these things together. So I don't maybe have a great answer, but I have a theory.
And the question of language.
Language. I mean, most of these maps that we looked at from the 15th and 16th century were made in, many were made in Venice, Rome. Many of them were in Latin. You started getting more Dutch maps later in the 17th century. You know, you should probably a better person to ask that question of would be Ellen Crafting, because she's the head of the Maritime Modernities Project, and she's looking specifically at she's done some research on hand-drawn maps, but she's also more attuned to the uses by Scandinavian historical actors of some of these maps. I was really looking at. I just surveyed every map that was in the National Library of Norway that looked at Northern European ocean space, and they were maps from all over, all over the place. So that I don't think that's a very good way to get at potential users. It really is more to do with map creators, I think.
Thank you.
Pablo?
Do you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk, Helen. I'm very much interested in your mention to Humboldt. I don't know if you know an historian and philosopher of Earth System Sciences called Klein Hans. He's Dutch. He's a Jeeps colleague. He's written a paper with him. And so he talks about the origin of system thinking. And he mentions obviously Humboldt, but he's more critical because he says that there's not enough reasons to think that actually Humboldt was the pioneer of systemic thinking about the Earth as we do right now, and so on and so forth. But I found it very interesting that in your talk, it was thanks to Humboldt, or a kind of maybe sort of an inspiration, that the oceans, the topography of the oceans, were started to be seen as a continuity of Earth's topography. So in that sense, the ocean as a basin is integrated is integrated in the surface of the Earth. So there's not a deep disruption between our physical and geographical understanding of terrestrial ecosystems or terrestrial surfaces and the marine surfaces. So I don't know if you have like any further thoughts on this. Do you think your example can be actually part of a big history of systemic thinking, especially regarding the oceans and so on?
I mean, I think it would be wise to be dubious that Humboldt, would be talking about systematic thinking in quite the way that we do. But there's an article written by Humboldt by Michael Reedy that talks about how many people who study Humboldt forget that he didn't begin with mountains; he began with the sea. His first writings about and first sort of musings about physical geography happened on a boat and in interactions with ocean space. And so I do feel like I didn't mention, but the thing that Matthew Fontaine-Maury accomplished in that physical geography of the sea book which also appeared in his very practical sailing explanations and sailing directions, was that he created the first ocean basin scale bathymetric maps. And so, we learned a bit more from Yip about where contour lines of depth came from. So that isn't what's novel. What's novel is that he thought he had enough what's novel, or perhaps what's a better word? He thought highly of himself, that he had enough data points to make that kind of a map, and he was doing so because he felt like it contributed to this enterprise that Humboldt had defined and set forth. And so I think it's better in Maury's case to understand his relationship to Humboldt as sort of using Humboldt as an excuse for, or as a marker for this knowledge he felt he was producing, and this knowledge creation he was contributing to. It's, I would think of it more in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Like, he really was thinking that he was creating sort of global knowledge in some sense.
Well, and he was thinking that he was taking physical geography and doing it for the first time ever for the ocean, and for the ocean on a scale of an ocean basin. And I mean, he's a complicated character. He was very, very strongly criticized by his peers at the time in the United States. He was very admired by many people in Europe, though mostly in the military, for his efforts to internationalize science. He's a complicated figure. And he's certainly not anyone who most people say, in retrospect, was a great scientist. But it's important to study him as a scientist for many reasons. And one is this is what Michael Reedy and I argued in our ocean paper. These graphical representations, his and other people's as well, were so critical in the mid-19th century for representing this increasing ocean knowledge and rendering it useful.
I see. Thank you.
Helen, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, but if you had a question connected to
No,
us-
I'm saying no, previous, but sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. I'm sorry, I have a bunch of questions I'm gonna prioritize. So, oh yeah. So I really appreciate the effort to sort of try to look at the role of the depth of the sea in an imperial context and in the context of colonization. And as you mentioned, Bouchard's work on fisheries,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying myself to sort of clarify things for me, but he talks about these fisheries are sort of settler colonies, right? He mentions the point about settlement, and that's sort of his argument, which is something that I'm personally very interested in and looking into as well. But I'm wondering how do we conceptualize this difference? Why are these specific fisheries that are there to extract resources, why can we look at them as settler colonies as opposed to, again, a more sort of traditional resource extraction type of colony, which is something that I'm sort of trying to understand. Can we talk about settler colonialism at sea?
Right.
Because the point of settler colonialism is specifically to settle people on land and to sort of like, yes, of course, take extract resources and take whatever you can from the land, but specifically for the colonists and for them to be able to literally live there and move there permanently.
Yeah.
But I am myself looking at situations in which the sea definitely helped or was an instrument of settler colonialism. But I'm wondering if that argument can be made, if the sea can be, if that space can be seen as a site of settler colonialism or just as a sort of a means to get that on land. I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mean, really, well, we should put you directly in touch with Jack. But I think what I find helpful about Jack Bouchard's work is that I don't think he's talking about it exactly. He's admitting it's not settler colonialism, but he's saying that these boats, many of the same boats, but it doesn't matter, so many hundreds of boats are going to these waters seasonally and staying there for long periods of time. So it's not settler colonialism, but it functions very much more like that than past historians have allowed for. And I see where you're going with submarine cables, because I feel like one of the things about infrastructures is that infrastructures can kind of carry and embed and quietly project and power even when there aren't people there. I mean, this is something that's been interesting for me from the beginning of my career. I said I wanted to study the ocean and ocean's history. And, early on, people said, well, there are no people in the ocean and history is about people. So what are you talking about? You can study people on boats, but you can't study people in the ocean. But I think, it's clear now that we can study traces of people in oceans in very profound ways. And so I do think you're going to find something useful there, and I look forward to what you find. But I do think you can talk about ocean space in these ways that reflect colonialism, but you may have to think about how it's similar and how it's different from terrestrial history.
No, that's amazing. Thank you. Really useful. But if you
Go ahead.
it's okay, completely, because this is completely disconnected, and it's actually more of a what's the word, brainstorming. But I was also going to ask Alessandra's question about like what happens in the 17th century. Why do we lose this visual knowledge? Because it is surprising that sort of like when you get into the enlightenment, good issue with this word, but when you get to that point, which is all about knowledge and it's all about discoveries and everything, well, on charts you see the opposite thing. You see that disappearing. But then I don't know if you could make a connection to, I don't know, maybe the issue of accuracy, and sort of even connected to what you were saying about Murray and his colleagues, the fact that he's using religion and mysticism and all of that, which his colleagues and his contemporaries and people from the 17th century as well, like, oh, these pictures of sea monsters,
right?
They're sea monsters. We are all about, science and rationality, and let's forget about that. But then at the same time, some of those images depicted like fisheries, like you said, like deep ocean knowledge that then was completely lost.
Yeah.
Maybe because it wasn't considered like accurate enough and reliable enough.
Or maybe because maps just were no longer the right place to put that information. I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, clearly what we're lacking here is people who know about 18th century history.
Yeah.
And I guess I would suggest maybe one place to look for something like an answer to this question is Margaret Shoddy's work on her book Sailing School and some of her other work, because I think, she's showing how this very detailed ocean knowledge and knowledge about navigation gets funneled into certain places and institutions and people, their brains and the tools that they use and things like that. So, I guess I started out with this idea that these 18th century maps with latitude and longitude and otherwise blank oceans, meant something about an absence. But now I actually think that it probably means that it represents all of that knowledge being there. It just doesn't belong on that map anymore.
Okay. Which is also an interesting way to look at the sort of categorization of sciences that happens in the modern period.
That's a good point. Thanks for that. That's a really good point.
You just separate knowledge.
Yes.
And
yes.
Represent it.
There is a forthcoming book by Enrique Leitao and Jose Maria Madrid. What is his last name? Anyway, I should have invited them to this talk. I don't know why I didn't think of that before, but they look at an earlier period, not 18th century, but rather 16th, 17th century. But they also look at this distinction that you were mentioning between maps and nautical charts.
Yeah.
And then try to understand. One of the things they argue is that the famous problem of longitude was not important for nautical charts, was not important for sailors, but they used different techniques to mark that.
Interesting.
It was very important for world maps and all kinds of maps interested in sovereignty, and that's why the first thing you did when you arrived in America was to settle your longitude. But it was not necessarily so interesting for navigators. So they use this distinction a lot, and it would be very interesting to see how it develops from the 16th century into the 18th century.
Yes, that would be.
Please.
Just a question following what Lynn was saying. First of all, thank you for your talk. It's interesting. I'm wondering about the terminology used in the early age that you are speaking about. I see you distinguish between maps and charts. In nowadays, yes, we know what is charts and what is
but
maps.
not that.
But in that time, when you are investigating the references in Nordic or when you translate maybe the title, it was used a map or charts.
Oh, map
or carta, I don't know.
Map, chart is not, chart is a more modern word.
No, but carta nautica, carta marina, that was used. Some of the maps that you showed.
But that means map, I think, not chart.
Okay,
I think.
They don't.
But just to clarify, charts are used specifically for navigation. But map, it comes when we visualize the space.
I think so,
So navigation starts early? I mean, when
so the first navigational charts are portolan charts, and there's a kind of a trajectory of the history of navigational charting that includes those charts by Wagner that I showed you, which themselves are not accurate enough to navigate with, but they have a lot of navigational information in them. And my understanding is sort of the next step after that was the modern navigational chart, which came out of that Dutch context. But that's not exactly, I mean, there are secondary sources that could tell you more. I've sort of read some of those, but that's not what I know much about. I'm really interested in how oceans were represented on different kinds of maps, and some of those maps, like portolan charts, did not represent ocean space at all. It's just blank, and they were also mostly hand-drawn maps. And so I was interested in these printed maps, which started out not being for navigation, but came to include more and more detail about oceans before navigational charts kind of became their own thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. The first visualization for the sea, it was, I mean, for the navigation. Or maybe that one that you showed are charts. Are not maps, but maps is a new concept when we visualize the space in general. But the first ones, and
the Ptolemaic ones,
I think that was for navigation, especially for navigation. What do you think when you were investigating the?
Well, the Ptolemaic maps were not for navigation. They were sort of ways of representing geography, Ptolemy's ancient Greek's geographic knowledge. And when Ptolemy was kind of rediscovered in Europe or taken up, I mean, the map I showed you was using the way that Ptolemy projected his land spaces that he was mapping, but it was the first time that anyone had mapped Scandinavia, because Ptolemy and the Greeks didn't know about Scandinavia, but those were not for navigational
It's
purposes.
funny that Columbus is said to have used Ptolemaic map to make his point on navigation, which is
Right.
different as using it for navigation. It was basically saying because there was some error.
That's a good point,
There
right?
was some error in measuring the longitudinal diameter of
That's
the
right.
Earth. He was saying, okay, Western Europe and the Far East are much closer than we thought. So if I sail west on the Atlantic, I will arrive to China
I will get there.
very early on.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think those early printed maps were not at all, they could be, that's a really good
It
point
was
to make.
useful geographical knowledge.
They were useful for talking about navigation, but they weren't practical. Portolans were practical for actually navigating.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have a very easy question to answer, which is basically, could you tell us more about slavery and Maury? Because I know you
Yeah.
kind of there, but
Yeah.
but I think to have a more clear connection of
Right.
that to the science that
Right.
you were describing.
Well, and I would also suggest that you take a look at Jason Smith's work on his book To Master the Boundless Sea, and he's working on a new project now, which includes study of Alfred Thayer Mahan. So just to close that loop, but Maury was part of this project, and very Maury very actively and deliberately so, to try to gain and use ocean knowledge to promote American empire. So, early on, it had to do a little of the American whalers and kind of catching up with them in a way, and helping make the seas and the places where they made landfall and reprovisioned and stuff kind of safe for American commerce, and following that, other American imperial endeavors, including the submarine telegraphy, which was
But specifically
Anglo-American.
the expansion.
But so the slavery was that, during the Civil War, Maury sided with the Navy, with the Confederacy, and but he was interested and involved in several efforts to use exploration and ocean knowledge and knowledge of how to move around the oceans to support schemes to move American racial slavery to Mexico or to other places in South America when it started looking like things were not going to go well in the American Civil War. So you can, Penn's in my article talks about this more, and then there's a scholar named Michael Burney who's written quite a bit about this. So you can find the citations and Penn's in on my article, but it's really, and it's so important to I mean, and that was what animated him. That was his motive for doing this work, was to strengthen the American South as part of strengthening the U.S. nation. But he himself was fervently committed to the institution of slavery. So it's important to understand that was built into his motive for doing all this work.
Okay, interesting. You have more questions?
I mean, it's just because I thought it would be about like making the slave trade more efficient, the navigation.
Yeah, no, because the slave trade was over by then, theoretically.
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't
Supposedly,
exactly,
yeah.
but yeah.
But was it then a matter of status? We are this sort of pioneering nation, so we should have this power to sort of do what we want in other territories. Or was it about literally, this knowledge helps us bring these people there?
Both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Slavery. Interesting. Interesting.
Okay, anything else here or online? Okay, good. I think it was long enough the Q&A, so we're happy. Yeah, thanks again,
Thanks.
Helen. I forgot to say at the beginning, but you kind of implied it, that this is the last talk of this year's seminar, and it is that reason that we invited Helen to close it, as we had invited Tony Adler to open it. And of course, next academic year, starting in September, we will start a new series that we will announce sometimes in the summer. So thank you very much, Helen, for helping us with this endeavor.
Thank you.
Okay.